welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today I'm super excited. We're working on my last gown project of the year, so let's talk through it. First thing I have here, this beautiful black fabric that has all these little sequins guys on it, or not sequins, rhinestones is what I was looking for. Has all these really beautiful rhinestones on it, and I picked this up in New York. I knew I wanted it for a very special project, and today is finally the day that I'm gonna get to use it. And to go with that beautiful fabric, I have this 1930s evening gown pattern by Lady Marlowe. She does really great reproductions. I am going to be doing version 1, the full length. However, I have decided I'm going to flip the zipper to the back and have the front be a clean line. So that is a little change in plan, but I think it will work really, really, really well. What I will say is I actually don't know how to sew something this year. My plan was to use French seams, but like now that I'm re-looking at the pattern, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed because I realized I have to figure out what I'm doing with facings. So what I'm going to do first before I cut any fabric or cut the pattern out is I'm going to do some research on how you usually face a gown like this, and my guess is the answer is going to be you line it, you don't face it. So all that to say, I'm still very excited about this project. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to make. I am so excited to see the final results. So yeah, we're gonna jump back in on probably cutting out this pattern once I do some research and figure out what I'm doing. So because this is a Lady Marlowe pattern, it is one that I have to cut out before I can do anything else with, so that is what I'm doing here. Spooky stops in to say hello, and I have to watch her really closely because she loves shredding printer paper. Like, that's her favorite thing to do, and she did get her teeth on this pattern just a little bit, but that's okay. This is at least really sturdy paper. And then I am cutting this out. I had just enough fabric for this. We were getting a little tight. I was getting a little nervous there. I can't remember if I mentioned in the intro, but I am making a few different shifts to this pattern. The biggest being I'm moving the zipper from being down the front to down the back. So I'm placing pieces on folds that were previously seamed and cutting pieces to be seamed that were previously on fold. Mainly as in the front pieces were supposed to be on seam and the back pieces are supposed to be on fold, and I just switched them because I definitely knew I wanted the zipper on the back of this dress at this point in time. The other trick that I learned as I cut this out was because of the gems, it was easier to cut one layer at a time. So I would cut the top layer and then the bottom layer because sometimes I had to scoot around the gemstones. And then of course, as always, this is your reminder that I have both a Patreon and a Ko-fi where you can go over and support me for a monthly fee of $5.50. And with that, you get access to my videos about a week before they actually go up. And I know the footage for this is pretty mediocre, but what I'm doing here is I am marking any dart lines or anything like that with tailor's tacks. So I'm actually sewing in a line of marking, essentially. I used white thread for this so it would stick out really, really apparent. And yeah, this is how I'm going to mark all of the pleats that are in this pattern, which luckily aren't that many. And once all of those are marked out, I am all finished with cutting this out. And from there, I began the really, really intensive process of removing all of the stones from the seam allowances. This is really important when you use beaded fabric for a bunch of different reasons. One, so you don't break your needle on your machine. Also, you don't want these stones and beads causing irritation in the inside of your seams. And with this one too, since I was doing French seams, I didn't want to be putting these gems into French seams. So it's for a large variety of things. And in the process of picking all of these off, I found that these stones are all glass, which is wild. The pearls are plastic, but everything else is glass, which I was not expecting. And my method for taking these off, I remembered when I bought the fabric to ask how to remove stuff into the seam allowances, and they said to use heat. So what you see happening here is I will use a heating gun to heat up the glue just a little bit so the gems are, in theory, easier to peel. And I say in theory because probably like 80% of the gems were really easy to peel and about 20% were a nightmare no matter how much heat I used. And I learned there was definitely like a learning curve for figuring out how much was too much heat, to the point that then it would melt the tool and cause holes. So this was quite a learning process, and later I found a much better technique to do this, but this is how I did most of the gem removal in the seam allowance, and it was incredibly time intensive. The other thing you'll see happening here sometimes is I am using some wire cutters to cut out the backing of the gems gems that are also not like stapled on here, but it's like a prong method that they have both diamonds and pearls onto this with, which was not ideal. I wish honestly all the gems on this were this fused backing, but it wasn't that way, and that's okay. In the future, I will probably look out more for, if I was going to do this again, something that just does one way or the other, so that way you can just focus in on that method and not have to switch between the two. But eventually I did finally wrap up most of getting out the gems from the seam allowance. From here, my next step is putting in the pleats for the bodice. This is only in the front bodice. They have 8 little tucks that will give you some forming around your breast, so that way it like fills it and it looks nice and it isn't just like a flat weird piece of fabric. So I am pinning the line of these basting like tailor's marks that I put in, and I am pinning everything together exactly where I will follow the pins to actually sew this. And I guess to know, I also removed the gems that would be in these tucks. And then once I get them pinned correctly, I'm pulling out the white thread so it doesn't get caught in the eventual stitching. Right after that, I attempted to iron them to lay the correct way. Quickly abandoned use of the iron for this project because I could just tell this material was going to gum up my iron and like have some different issues with heat. So I just decided to nix the iron and be really intentional about how I'm sewing everything down. I rarely tell you to skip ironing, but with this material, I opted out of ironing entirely. And I decided also by this point I had well and decided to not use a lining. So I am doing French seams. So I've sewn these, I'm cutting down the seam allowance, and then I'll sew them again the other way. And one of my methods that I ended up doing for these French seams was I would sew that French seam, and then I would usually have to clear a few more stones to then sew the second part of that French seam, which isn't super shocking. I was trying to be conservative in removing stones because I didn't want all of my seam lines to be very, very bare looking compared to the rest of the dress. So I tried to make sure any stones that I could keep, I did keep. I then did a bunch of research on how I wanted to finish my edges for this because since I'm not lining it, I'm not figuring out facings. So what I found was a technique somewhere on the internet where first you sew a basing line of stitches, which is what you see me doing here. Then you trim the allowance to about 1/4 inch. And then you use your zigzag stitch on your machine and you basically stitch that little 1/4 inch seam allowance down with a zigzag seam so it kind of like tightens it and pulls it together. And then you turn it one more time, kind of like a double turn hem that is zigzag stitched to just kind of like crumple everything together. And in theory, this should make the neckline feel more finished and less itchy and less prone to ripping and all of that good stuff. I ended up deciding I liked this finish enough that once I got the neckline done, I actually went ahead and just for the top bodice piece, because there's the top bodice piece, there's like the waistband, and then there's the skirt piece. So for just the top bodice piece, I decided in the back I wanted to fasten it just at the top and then kind of have like almost like a slit down the back instead of having that be a full zipper. So I'm going to use this technique again when I do that, and it is going to be a lot easier there because those are straight lines. And I don't know why I decided I needed to get this in this night, but I also stitched together the front seam of the skirt, and again I used a French seam there. Here I am the next weekend. I have gotten my tea and I am wrapping up finishing all of the seams on the skirt. So we have the front seam that you saw me start the other night, then I have 2 side seams, and I'm leaving the back completely open for now until I wrap up some other pieces. Off camera I have made the like kind of belt, quote unquote. You'll see what I mean when we get to the reveal, but this is like the midsection piece of the bodice that connects the bottom and the top. And here what I'm doing is setting up this French seam for that waistband being attached to the skirt. I have notches in here, I'm following all the markings, following all the seam lines, and I'm pretty pleased because my math ended up adding up. Anytime you flip a zipper from the front to the back or vice versa, or from a side seam to the back, you can end up with math that didn't go correctly, so I was pretty excited that this went correct. And then here I am sewing that encasing seam for the garment. A little too late, I actually finally looked up what your tension should be at for tulle, and I lowered my tension to 4 instead of being at 8, which I think is my standard on the machine. And it made a huge difference while sewing. I didn't have to be nearly as careful about keeping my fabric taut and doing all these things. So like, I don't often talk about my thread tension on this channel, but always check your thread tension for projects. Do a little little research on what your fabric should be. And then I do want to note, you see me doing it here. Occasionally while sewing, I realized I didn't remove a bead that I needed to, so I am removing it while on the sewing machine. I tried to do the best I could to have to do as little as possible on the sewing machine, but stuff happens. And I have sewn up the French seam in the skirt of the back because I now know exactly what length of zipper I'm using. I found a black zipper in my stash. The zipper had to be black for this project. And so what I'm doing here is you see me stitching with this teal and green thread. This is so I can easily tell the stitches in this project that I'm going to need to rip out, because this is just the basting that's going to help me secure the zipper. And I need to be able to see it because none of it should be here in the final product. And then because ironing didn't work well for this project, what you see me doing here is folding my seam allowance on the zipper open and then pinning it. And usually I do a one-sided placket, but this time I just needed to get the zipper in, and the ideal was for the top to be down the center, like the middle of the zipper. So here I am pinning that. And what's nice is because I put in that stitching with teal and green, anytime I flip it up, I can really see if it's fully centered on this zipper. And once I installed the zipper, which actually wasn't as bad as I was expecting it to be, I am now just trying to find those bits of green and teal thread to cut to then be able to rip out the basting that closed the seam before the zipper was sewn in. This worked really, really well, and the reason I did this is because if you use black thread, sure, you're not going to be able to see it, but you're also more likely to actually rip your tool when you're doing the seam ripping, and this way was successful in not resulting in any ripped tool. All of my tool came out non-ripped, which is especially important in a zipper because a zipper in tool is already a choice that the internet told me that they wouldn't recommend, but I was like, I can't figure out a different way to do this, so tool zipper situation it is. This did end up being successful for me, so I do recommend using a contrast thread when you're basting your seam open for your zipper in tool. From there, I am now sewing the top of the bodice to the waistband, and here what you see me doing is again using my heat gun. If you get a fabric like this, I learned it makes a big difference to use the heat gun on the ironing board versus in the air like you saw me at the very beginning. In the future, I'll only use a heat gun like this on the ironing board because I was really able to heat up the stones a lot more effectively without risking overheating the fabric. I think because there isn't so much air around it, the heat didn't diffuse off the stone and the glue as much as when it was just kind of like hanging willy-nilly in the air. And here what you see is, again, I'm clearing just a few more stones because of the French seaming. I didn't cut this with French seaming in mind, so I didn't quite have the stones as picked out as maybe I should have, but a French seam was definitely the right choice on this project. And then with that sewn, I now have to figure out the gathers for the waistband. So this would work a lot better if I had left my zipper in the front, because then I would have something less flexible to get my gathers to. So I put the gathering stitches in by hand, and I did 3 in a row of just kind of, you know, trying to gather tool. This was a choice. And then once I gathered that thread to the 4.5 inches the pattern called for, I tried the dress on, and you won't see me do this, but I actually ended up taking the gathers and actually gathering it to 1.5 inches because I thought that made the dress look a lot better than just kind of like this like really mild gather. This gather was so mild you could barely see it, and I really felt like it was a much prettier dress when the gathering was much more intense, which, to be fair, this dress was not designed to be done in tulle like this. Like, this is not the material or the vision for this dress. This dress is supposed to be like a house coat, like a house jacket. It's not really an evening dress style pattern. So I get that they weren't thinking of tulle when they made these gathers. These gathers would have looked excellent in the cotton that this pattern was intended for, and with the zipper up front. Once that was all figured out, I got to work on hemming the skirt. So I tried it on, and at first I trimmed off about 3 inches from the hem because it was too long. I tried it on one more time, and I ended up cutting off about another inch just because I generally prefer to have my gowns, I would rather err on them being like 1/2 inch too short than 1 inch too long, especially because hemming this is going to require me pulling all of the stones off the bottom. So I was just trying to make sure I ended up with a hem that I like. Other projects, it's not as big of a deal because it's so easy to do a hem. So if you hem it and you don't like it, you only lose like a half hour, but I knew I would lose hours of time if I didn't get the hem where I wanted it the first time. And then once the hem was looking good, I went and I pulled all of the stones off the bottom inch of the skirt skirt so that way I could hem it. And I'm going to use a similar method that I used for the neckline and the, I guess, sleeves / sleevelessness armholes, which you can barely see it here, but I am on that double turn of that zigzag. And I think this is the first one that I completed with my tension being correct. And again, having your tension be a lot looser with tulle was a game changer for this project. From there, I am on to my final step in the process, which is sewing on the button to close the neckline, as well as adding the corresponding button loop. But with that, we are all ready for the reveal. I can't wait for you to see this dress. Alrighty, you have seen the reveal at this point. I went to one of my favorite spots usually when the hydrangeas are in bloom, where they looked really beautiful this fall with also like the leaves. I'd be curious where you live, but where I live, the leaves for fall have really stuck. Usually at this point we would have 0 leaves on trees, but we still have trees with leaves, which is very strange. But that said, we're gonna get into the cost breakdown. I have my trusty spreadsheet here for the fabric. This was incredibly expensive fabric. I don't know if I mentioned at any other point in the video, but the gems on it are all actually glass. These are not plastic, and then they're heat fused. I do think you could probably find it on Etsy cheaper than I got in the Newark Fashion District, and I spent $283.07 on it. So that already brings this cost this gown pretty high. For the notions, I just needed thread, a button, and a zipper. So I spent $4.23 on notions. And then for the pattern was $27.95, and that was from Lady Marlowe. That brings us to a supply total of $315.25. So that was my cost for this dress. That's what I paid. Like I said, the fabric was really high quality, and I think this dress looks really expensive. So I'm okay with that cost. It feels really steep. Guess it could be worse. Gowns are expensive, especially gowns with high quality things. But next up, we'll talk about labor and time and how long it took me to make this dress. Disclaimer, I guess this dress would have not taken very long at all had I not had to get all of the bead work or the rhinestone work out of the seams. That took probably 5 hours of this project. I don't think I put an exact number on it. To show you truly where the effort of this, I put the de-stoning of the dress into the cutting category. So I wrote that I spent 8.5 hours cutting this fabric, and that would just be all the fabric prep. That would be cutting out the pattern, cutting out the fabric in the pattern, and then de-rhinestoning the seam allowances. So that tells you really how much work as opposed to the sewing. So if you were to make this dress with a normal fabric, the sewing for this took 5.5 hours. This dress pattern itself was not complicated, it was just the material that was complicated. And of course, if you used a cotton, you could have pinked it instead of using French seams and all that good stuff, right? But that brings us to a total of 14 hours of me making this garment. I feel actually for a gown, this is relatively fast. I feel I definitely have gowns that hit into the 20 hours. I think a gunny sacks usually pushes me into the 17 to 18 hour range. So 14 hours for what is such a complex looking dress, I don't think is too bad at all. And then here in this channel, We do talk about labor as if you are paying for labor. Of course, I would not expect to be paid to do something that's a hobby, but I just want to bring the conversation about how much our clothing costs and what it means for the workers being paid. I multiply the number of hours I work on something by a living wage here in Seattle, which is $35.39. So I multiply that 14 hours by $35.39, and then I get a labor total of $495.46. Which is really expensive labor-wise. I never say this is a one-to-one like factory comparison or anything like that, but I just would like you to think about how much labor actually goes into products. And I will say, having looked online, I could find very few garments for sale that had any fabric anywhere near similar to this. Oftentimes, fabrics online, they'll use sequins because you should clear the seam allowances of your sequins to make for a more comfortable garment. Most places don't. You just don't commonly see stuff like this for sale as a ready-made garment, which also makes sense for a lot of reasons. But before we go into those reasons or my thoughts on that, the grand total of what this cost me labor-wise and supplies-wise is $810.71. For a gown like this, I don't think that's crazy. Gowns are like not real life. I am lucky and I go to the theater enough to wear a gown like this, but gowns are like a luxury item. I would consider this a luxury dress, and I don't think $810 for a luxury dress is anything crazy. Like, yes, would that be really expensive for a dress that's probably not even gonna look like the picture that you order on Shein or Temu? No, it is not gonna cost, like those are gonna cost way less, which I'll talk about actually right now, because the other thing I try to do is I try to find something comparable on different websites and talk about why that is, how it works, all of that. So again, my supply cost, what I paid to make this was $315.25. For the fast fashion, the ultra fast fashion, this is your Temus, your Sheins. You could even maybe say your Forever 21s, but that lowest low is $45 was what I found that was anywhere near equivalent. What I was looking for was some seam work in the bodice, some darts, and then I was looking for anything fabric-wise that looked like this, and in this case, this was like a very cheap looking sequin, and this was something that I suspected if you actually ordered that $45 dress, it would not look anything like the dress pictured. That just is like something that happens all the time with gowns. Recently, I went thrifting for the first time in like a year, and the number of gowns that I could just tell were ordered from a place like Temu or Shein, where they catfished you with the picture, was wild, and I felt like it really put this project into perspective. Gowns are expensive, especially a gown with like the proper seaming and structure. It's going to cost a lot of money. For your mid-tier fashion, this would be your Anthropologie, your Urban Outfitters, your Zara's. I found a dress for about $300, so that is $15 cheaper than what I paid for mine. Again, I thought the fabric on this looked pretty cheap. I couldn't find anything that like was truly stoned the way this was stoned until we got into the slow fashion category. So this one was kind of more of like that beaded sequin that you see a lot of during the holidays, especially in a gown. This gown is more likely from the mid-tier to actually look like what they have the model in. But it is still likely not made using ethical labor. Most of these places don't bother to check their labor and use questionable factories, or their factories outsource things to other questionable factories. So it's still common from this level of tier to end up with a piece that has still not been ethically made. And then for your slow fashion, I just looked for a gown brand that knew all of its labor sources. That was my goal. I didn't look at like the sustainability of this from a like fabrics perspective. This fabric that I used is made of polyester or nylon or some other fossil fuel. So we are not looking at something probably particularly sustainable from a materials perspective, but I was looking for something sustainable from a labor perspective. And the cost for a dress from this place that was about similar, I will say it was maybe even slightly more structured than what I have here, was $738. So all that considered, I think this dress was really worth my time to make. I love gowns, and like I said, I will wear gowns. I will find occasion to wear gowns. So I am pretty happy with my costs for this. This is also like one of my very special projects for the year. So I'm more than happy with that, and we can now talk about the dress and get a little bit out of the labor dialogue, although I'm gonna keep a little bit of like labor thought into this. As you can sort of see, I know it's so sheer you can't really see it on a hanger. This is the dress. I should check, but because all of these stones except for the pearls are glass, this is a very heavy dress. I think that helps with how it drapes, but also conversely, while I think it looks really nice in this material, I think the pattern that I used would probably look better in a cotton material because this just pulls the waist and pulls the bust and pulls everything down, which works because it's sheer, but like probably wouldn't work if it was a non-sheer fabric. I did wear this to go see Wicked the musical. If I remember, I'll pop in a photo of me wearing it in front of the stage. I had never seen Wicked. This dress will have a lot of fond memories for me. It will always be semi-connected to Wicked. But all that said, it is definitely going to be a really useful piece for me. So I went back and forth so much about whether I was going to line this dress. The biggest reason I decided not to line it is because it just gives me a lot more versatility, because if I substitute the color under it, which I wore that, it actually matches my hair pretty closely, slip under it for the reveal, mainly because I wanted you guys to be able to see the waist lines and all the different lines in the skirt. That makes this a really cool vintage pattern. I also got a much more like skin showing blue slip to wear under this. That will be a lot sexier look. And then I also wanted to be able to, I act like I go places where I could wear something like this. I would love to be able to wear this out somewhere where I could just wear it with like pasties and a black underwear. That alone is like 3 really different looks for this dress. So I just feel like this dress will have a lot of versatility for me. And the other thing I could definitely do is I could use some different petticoats I have to really fluff up the dress in certain ways, because the skirt is actually quite full, as you saw from the pattern pieces. So there's a lot of really cool different things I can do because this dress is sheer. Now the con for the dress being sheer, which I am going to do before I wear it in a few weeks, is I found this neckline pretty unbearable. It's really tight and scratchy around my neck. So my plan for that is I am going to probably lower the neckline by 1 inch all the way around. So what I'll do is I'll sew 1 inch away from the current line, and then I will do the same technique that the current line has, and I think that'll loosen it up and make it feel a lot better for me. Other than that, I found this dress incredibly comfortable. I was concerned that I would find the stones like kind of digging into me, but I did not find that to be true at all. I guess I haven't like sat on a hard chair in it, and I don't plan to be clear. Other thoughts on the project. So obviously I changed the zipper to the back, and I made the back up here kind of this open peekaboo moment. Really happy with those choices. I think overall I'm just really happy with the style choices I made in general. I do think the sleeves are cute. I would maybe considering just making the sleeves a normal sleeve instead of this kind of like handkerchief sleeve, but for now I think I'll leave it. I first just need to tackle the neckline and see, once the neckline is improved, if I feel better about the whole thing overall. I mean, the other thing I could do, I could actually take this to quite a deeper V, which would potentially be fun, but I don't think I want to deal with the math and cutting that you have to put into that. As far as craftsmanship, I feel like I did overall a really good job. There are some points in both the border and the seams where I couldn't get all of the glue out. So there's just kind of like what feels like big smatterings of glue. You would never notice it if you hadn't made the dress. I only noticed it because I made the dress. So ultimately, it's not that big of a deal. It just is something I noticed. I think also this gown is going to work for me for a long time from a size perspective. I definitely have some room to grow and breathe in this dress, which is great. I've been trying to really sew my wardrobe with much more thought into how long I can actually wear the thing, and especially with such expensive and special material, I wanted to be really intentional. And I have probably an extra couple of inches in the waist if I need it, but without having that actual additional inches on my physical waist, the dress still fits, but I think it will fit well into the future, which makes me happy. Plans for wearing it this season, I will wear it to not to see Wicked in the movie theater. I am like a sweats at the movie theater type of person. I want to feel like I'm watching in my living room, but I will likely wear this. I'm going to see Jinx Monsoon and Ben de la Creme's Christmas special. They always do a really fun and irreverent Christmas special, so I'll probably wear it to that. I might try wearing it with the much more sexy slip under it. With the pink slip that I picked up and that you saw for this, I will also wear that to, I think, all of my family's holiday stuff. We usually do pictures in front of the tree and go somewhere nice to eat, so I'll probably wear it for that. And then I'll probably wear it for my company's holiday party, which is going to be in January, and I always have a fun time dressing up for that. So that's just about 3 more uses just this year. And then this is a dress that, because of what I can put under it being so versatile, I could potentially wear this to Pride events, and I can wear it honestly to like any night at the theater, because this is so, hopefully once I fix the neckline, this will be so comfortable that it'll be a really great statement piece while also being comfortable to wear to the theater. I always try to dress up as nice as I can when I go to the theater because I think it's a really novel and fun experience to do that. But yeah, that's all of my thoughts for this project. Hopefully you learned something new, you enjoyed this. I know I definitely actually learned a lot of new things during this project, which is really exciting. I'm so thankful that the last 2 projects of the year I felt like I could really use to elevate my skills even further. For the rest of the year, I'm going to have a thrift haul for you, I think next week. And then the week after that, I believe, is my year up review. I take all of the stats that I take during the year, I put them into charts, I give you all the details. I believe the week after that is going to be me talking about my plans for the next year. That's just a really long-winded way of saying I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more. As always, give this a thumbs up and comment down below. It helps me out in the algorithm. And if you desire, you can either go over to Ko-fi and send me a one-time tip, or go over to Patreon and do a monthly membership. You can also do the monthly membership on Ko-fi. I just wanted to highlight that you can also do a one-time tip on Ko-fi. And then subscribe and stick around. If you've made it this far, hopefully that means you like me or you hate watch me, whatever. I'll take the ad revenue either way from you. And I will see you next Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Toodaloo!